everybody, so today we're going to talk about nested for loops in Java. So, as with conditional statements, we often see situations where we need to nest one loop inside of another loop. So for example, what if I wanted to print out each character of a string 3 times? So, for example, hello would be H, 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 E, 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 L, 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 O, 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 right? So for this, I would need a loop to loop through every letter of hello, and then I would need another loop that is just going to then print something 3 times each time. So this inner loop is just like a counter type loop where here this is just like do something, do whatever this is 3 times. And then this outer loop is the looping through a string type loop. And so you'll often see situations like this. So here what happens is I first start with I is equal to 0, then we jump right into this inner loop. Now we have j is equal to 0. Notice with nested loops that there's a separate counter variable inside. So the first loop starts with an I, int I, and then the second loop has to be something other than I. And that's because I, when it's declared up here, so this is when you declare the variable, calling it an integer, that's declaration, then that means that the variable is going to exist between this curly bracket and this curly bracket, which means that you can't redeclare I again until after you've come out of this curly bracket. So here we need to come up with another variable, and it's usually j. So anyway, back to going through this loop. So I starts at 0, then j starts at 0, and then we print word.char at I. So that's going to be the first character of the word. So for example, H in hello. Then this inner loop has not finished yet. So now this inner loop is going to increment. J is now going to be 1. I is still 2, or I is still 0, and j is 1. So now j being 1 doesn't really matter except for the fact that now this is going to print again. So it's going to print word.char at I, which is still 0. So again, it would still print H in hello. Then it's going to increment again to 2, and it's just going to print again the first character of the string. And then once j increments to 3, now this loop is going to exit. So now we exit this for loop, we go back around to now this for loop, and now I finally increments to the next value of 1. And then we dive back into this inner loop, and we do the whole thing over again, like Groundhog's Day. So then now j is going to be 0, then 1, then 2, and then we go back into the upper loop again, and now I is going to increment to 2, and then we go from there. So here's another example. What do you think that switching the inner and the outer loops would do? So do you think it would print out the same thing? So here, if we started with the word hello, do you think that this would still print out H, 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 E, 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 L, 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 O, O, O? Or would it print something different? So here, the outer loop is doing I equals 0 to I less than 3, and then the inner loop is looping through the word dot length. So what do you think would happen here? So for this inner loop, what actually happens is when you loop through the entire length of a string and you just print the character each time, then you just print all the characters in the string. So that means this first inner loop just prints hello. Then we come out of that loop, we go to our second, our outer loop, and now I is going to be 1. So I increments from 0 to 1. But then guess what? This inner loop just prints again. So we print hello again. So this is just a really fancy way of printing hello, because you're just printing each character one at a time. But then we go to the outer loop again, it increments again, and we print hello again. So here we're printing hello 3 times, not each letter in hello 3 times. So formally, we can say that a nested loop is a loop within a loop. It's an inner loop within the body of an outer one. So the first pass of the outer loop triggers the inner loop, which then executes to completion. So the inner loop completely executes, and then the second pass through the outer loop triggers the inner loop all over again, and again, and again, and again, as many times as the outer loop tells it to. So I like to think of nested loops as a clock, because if you think about a clock, you have the second hands, you have the hour hands. So the second hand goes from 1 to 2 to 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 60 before the minute ever changes to 1. So if the minute is at 0, right, and then we count seconds, we're going to count seconds, like we're going to be in seconds land until we get to 60. And then once we get to 60, then I'm finally going to increment minutes by 1. And then after minutes gets incremented by 1, then seconds goes again 60 times. So seconds is the busier loop here, because for every time minute goes once, loops once, seconds is looping 60 times. And so seconds is your inner loop. And then also, if you want to look at this in terms of hours as well, then you can look at the fact that hours could actually be a third loop. And so you'd have seconds in the very center, and then minutes, and nested inside of hours. So yeah, you could have triple nested loops, you could have quadruple nested loops, if you really want to. It's super fun. Okay, so here's some code that would write that example that we were just talking about. So this is just nested loops that print out, it would print out minutes and seconds. So kind of like a stopwatch. So this would print all the minutes and seconds up to 12 minutes and 59 seconds. So what happens here is minutes first start at 0, then we dive into this loop. Seconds then starts at 0. Then we say, okay, if seconds is less than 10, I want to print minutes, which is 0, plus, and then I'm going to concatenate this colon and a 0. I'm putting a 0 in front because seconds looks weird if I don't have a 0 in front of a single digit. So it would be 0, 0, 0. Then seconds would increment. 0, 0, 1. Then seconds would increment. 0, 0, 2. 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 5, 0, 6, 0, 7, 0, 8, 0, 9. Once seconds gets to 10, now this else triggers, and it would be 0, 10. And then it would go all the way up to 60, and now we exit this loop after we get to 60. So we're at 59, then S increments. When it gets to 60, we skip the loop because it's not less than 60 anymore. And so then we go to the outer loop. Once we go to the outer loop, now minutes finally increments by 1. And then that's all it does, and then we dive right back into this inner loop and do it 60 more times. And we keep going like that. So here's another example of how we can print tables of things pretty easily using nested loops. So what this code does is we have rows and we have columns. And so we represent the rows with a variable r and columns with a variable c. And then here, notice that we have a system.out print no ln. So what happens here is r starts at 1, then I dive into this for loop. When I'm in this for loop, then c starts at 1. So now for when c is 1, it's just going to go into this line of code, system.out.print asterisk. So it prints an asterisk, but it does not return to the next line. So the enter key is not hit. And so then, right after that asterisk is printed, it's going to go back into this inner for loop. C is going to increment by 1, so now C is going to be 2, and then it's just going to print an asterisk again. So now we're at this asterisk. Okay? Then we're going to loop again. C is 3, prints this asterisk. Then we're going to loop again. C is 4, it's going to print this asterisk. And then it's going to come out of this for loop. It's going to print this line of code. So now we have system.out.print ln, which means that this is like hitting the enter key in your keyboard. So now it moves, boom, to the next row. Notice that we're starting our counter variables here at 1 instead of 0. And it doesn't really matter in this situation because we're not actually doing anything with R and C except using them as like placeholders for however many times our loop is looping. But the reason why we start at 1 and not 0 in this case is because if we look at this, we see 4 rows and we see 6 columns. So it kind of makes sense to start at 1. But in general, with loops, we start at 0. Okay, so after we loop through this entire line, then it prints the next line. Now it comes around and goes back to the outer for loop. Once it's at the outer for loop, now R is now 2. R will be 2, and then we do this whole inner for loop again. So asterisk, 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 then the new print line, then back into this for loop, then R increments to 3. Now I'm here. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Next line, prints a new line, goes back, and so on. And so this is how you would print a table of astrices. Astrices? That sounds wrong. Okay. Anyway, so the next example is a table again, but in this case I'm doing 6 rows and 6 columns, and I am printing, instead of an asterisk, I'm printing C each time. So in this case, what's going to happen is I'm going to have, okay, well R is 1, now C is 1. C is 1, I'm going to print C. Then I'm going to loop. C is 2, I'm going to print C. Then I'm going to loop. C is 3, I'm going to print C. Then I'm going to loop. C is 4, I'm going to print C. Then I'm going to loop again. C is 5, I'm going to print C. And then I'm going to loop again. C is 6, I'm going to print C. And then I'm going to loop out of this loop because 7 is not less than or equal to 6. Then I'm going to print a new line. So when I print a new line, now I'm here. R increments back to 2, right? So now R is 2, but who cares because we're not printing R. And then we go back into this loop and we start all over again at 1 with C. And now we're on the second row because we already did a new line, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This \T here just means tab. So this just tells Java that you want to tab between, or add a tab after this string. And instead of using, like, you could just click tab on, like you could just hit the tab key. But the only problem with that is if you're using, it will only get, like, when you hit the tab key, it will only space something by, like, say 5 spaces. It's not going to tab it so that it lines up perfectly. So if you have, like, bigger numbers, like if you did, like, 400 tab versus 1 tab, your tab would go further if you had the 400 and it's not supposed to. So anyway, so \T is the way that we would do that. So yeah. Alright, so the next one now is we have the same loop as before, except instead of printing C, we're printing R. So it's the same exact loop as before, but we're printing R instead of C. So what do we think this would do? If printing C gave us columns of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s, what would printing R do? Good. So printing R would give us rows of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s. How would I print a multiplication table? So a multiplication table works by rows and columns. So just like what we've been talking about. And so it has, like, if you did row 2 and column 2, 2 times 2 is 4. Row 3, column 4, 3 times 4 is 12. And so this makes it easy to do your multiplications. Yeah. So here, I'm going to start with our general row column code. So we have row is equal to 1, row less than or equal to 6, column is equal to 1, column less than or equal to 6. I want you guys to think about what would go in here. So what would I print in order to get 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? On the next row, I would get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. On the next row, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. So what would need to go there in order for this to print out? Think about it and try your best. Okay, so If you got this, good job. It's R times C. So we could take the row value and the column value, and here, so if we start R equals 1, C equals 1. 1 times 1 is 1. Then R equals 1, C equals 2. 1 times 2 is 2. R equals 1, C equals 3. 1 times 3 is 3, and so on. Okay, so now in class, the next time I see you, we're going to be doing some of these other tricky ones. So how can I get this? And we're going to do lots of practice with nested for loops. And that's it.